The first thing I noticed wasn't the cold, but the silence of my own engine as it sputtered and died right in the middle of a whiteout that had turned the world into a blurring wall of static. I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, watching the snow pile up against the hood of my sedan in heavy, wet sheets that seemed to swallow the light of my dying headlamps. I knew I couldn't stay in the car because the temperature was dropping faster than the fuel gauge. So I grabbed my heavy coat and stepped out into a wind that felt like 1,000 tiny needles pressing into my exposed skin. Through the swirling chaos of the blizzard, I saw a faint, flickering neon sign about 50 yards ahead, a sickly green glow that promised a rest stop, or at least a roof that wasn't made of thinning metal. I struggled through drifts that were already waist-deep, my lungs burning with every breath of the frozen air, until I finally reached the heavy glass doors of the station. Inside, the air was stale and smelled of burnt coffee and industrial cleaner, but it was warm, and that was all that mattered until I realized I wasn't alone in that hollow, fluorescent-lit square. A man was standing by the back windows, staring out at the storm with his hands buried deep in the pockets of a grease-stained canvas jacket. He didn't turn around when the door chimed, he just kept watching the snow. And for a second, I wondered if he was even breathing. "Rough night to be on the interstate," I said, my voice sounding thin and cracking in the vast silence of the tiled room. But he didn't respond for a long time. Finally, he turned his head just enough for me to see a jagged scar running down his jawline, and he whispered that the roads weren't just closed, they were gone, and that no one would be coming to plow this stretch until morning. I tried to keep my distance, picking a plastic booth near the front door, but my eyes kept drifting to the parking lot where his massive refrigerated semi-truck sat idling, its engine a low, rhythmic thrum that vibrated through the floorboards. Why was he still running the engine if he was stuck? And why was the back of the trailer wrapped in heavy industrial chains that looked far too thick for standard freight? My curiosity turned into a cold, sinking dread when I noticed he wasn't just resting. He was pacing the perimeter of the store, systematically locking every single emergency exit with a set of keys he shouldn't have had. I watched him through the reflection in the vending machine glass, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, as he reached the front door and slid the heavy deadbolt into place. "What are you doing?" I asked, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice, but he only looked at me with eyes that were as cold and empty as the storm outside. He told me that he had precious cargo that couldn't be seen by anyone, and since I had seen the truck, I was now part of the delivery schedule. I realized then that the cargo wasn't something he was protecting from the world, but something he was hiding, and the realization made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. He began to walk toward me, his heavy work boots thudding slowly on the linoleum, and I knew that if I stayed in that booth, I would be trapped in a corner with nowhere to run. I bolted toward the kitchen area, sliding over the stainless steel counter just as his hand swiped the air where my shoulder had been a second before. The kitchen was a maze of deep fryers and cold prep tables, smelling of old grease and darkness, and I scrambled into the walk-in freezer, not to hide, but to find a weapon. My fingers brushed against a heavy magnetic knife rack, and I gripped a dull cleaver, my breath coming in ragged, visible clouds in the sub-zero air of the unit. I heard him enter the kitchen, his footsteps slow and deliberate, the sound of a predator who knew his prey had run into a dead end. "There is nowhere to go," he called out, his voice unervingly calm. "The snow is 6 feet high against the windows and the power lines are down for miles." He was right about the isolation, but he didn't know that I had spent my summers working in places exactly like this, and I knew every inch of the ventilation layout. I didn't hide in the back of the freezer. Instead, I climbed onto the shelving units and pushed aside the flimsy ceiling tile that led to the crawl space above the drop ceiling. I pulled myself up into the dusty, cramped dark just as the heavy freezer door swung open, the light from the kitchen spilling across the floor where I had been standing moments ago. I lay flat on the metal beams, my heart thumping so loudly I was sure he could hear it through the tiles, watching through a small crack as he searched the freezer with a flashlight. He was frustrated now, kicking over crates of frozen fries and swearing under his breath, his calm demeanor replaced by a jagged, violent energy that made the situation feel even more lethal. I began to crawl, my elbows scraping against the rough insulation, moving toward the front of the building where the manager's office was located. If I could get to the landline, or better yet, the signal booster for the emergency radio, I might have a chance. But as I moved, a single screw gave way, and the ceiling tile beneath my knee groaned with the sound of snapping plastic. He stopped moving instantly, the beam of his flashlight snapping upward, searching the ceiling for the source of the noise. I froze, holding my breath until my lungs ached, watching the circle of light dance just inches away from my face through the gaps in the tiles. He began to laugh, a dry, rasping sound that chilled me more than the blizzard ever could, and he started stabbing the ceiling with a long metal rod he had found in the tool closet. Each thrust of the metal tore through the thin tiles, coming closer and closer to my legs as I scrambled backward in the dark. I reached the office vent and dropped down, crashing onto the desk and sending a cascade of papers and pens flying across the floor. I didn't have time to think. I grabbed the heavy fire extinguisher from the wall and waited by the side of the door. I knew he would be coming for the office next, thinking he had me trapped in a small room with only one exit. The doorknob turned, and as the door swung open, I didn't wait for him to speak. I pulled the pin and squeezed the handle, releasing a blinding cloud of white chemical powder directly into his face. He roared in pain, clutching at his eyes, and I used that split second to lung past him, sprinting back toward the front of the store. I didn't go for the locked front door. I went for the large plate glass window near the seating area. I grabbed a heavy metal chair and threw it with every ounce of strength I had left, the glass shattering in a spectacular explosion of shards that mingled with the incoming snow. I tumbled out into the drift, the cold hitting me like a physical blow, but I didn't stop. I ran toward the highway, not toward my car, but toward the sound of a distant, low rumble I had been hearing for the last few minutes. It was a snowplow, its massive yellow blade throwing up plumes of white as it cleared the emergency lane. I waved my arms frantically, screaming until my throat was raw, and for a terrifying second, I thought the driver wouldn't see me through the haze. But the air brakes hissed, and the giant machine ground to a halt just yards away from me. I climbed into the cab, shivering violently, and looked back at the rest stop. The man was standing in the broken window, his silhouette dark against the green neon light, watching us. He didn't follow me into the snow. He knew the game was over. As the plow driver called in the report over the radio, I realized how close I had come to being just another delivery that would never be found until the spring thaw. I never realized how much the modern world relies on the hum of electricity until the power grid finally buckled under the weight of the ice storm, leaving my suburban house in a silence so thick it felt like it was pressing against my eardrums. The blizzard had been howling outside for 6 hours, piling snow against the first-floor windows until the rooms became dim, blue-tinted caves of freezing air. I was standing in the kitchen, trying to light a single candle, when I heard the first splash coming from the bottom of the basement stairs. It wasn't the sound of a pipe bursting, but rather the heavy, rhythmic slosh of someone wading through the 6 inches of freezing runoff that had collected because the sump pump had died the moment the lights flickered out. I froze, the match burning down to my fingertips, as I realized the storm cellar door, the one that led directly to the backyard, had been left unlocked after I had moved the generator inside earlier that afternoon. I crept toward the basement door, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, and I pressed my ear to the cold wood just as the splashing stopped. "Is anyone there?" I called out, my voice barely a whisper, but the only response was the sound of a heavy, wet coat dragging across the concrete floor below. I reached for the doorknob, intending to lock it, but the mechanism clicked before I could touch it, the deadbolt sliding into place from the other side with a finality that made my blood run cold. I was locked inside my own living room, trapped in the main part of the house while a stranger claimed the dark, flooded belly of my home. I backed away, my mind racing through every possible entry point, realizing that the person downstairs didn't just want warmth. They had locked the door to ensure I couldn't get out to the garage where the only phone with a signal was kept. The temperature in the house was dropping rapidly, and I could see my own breath blooming in front of my face like ghostly clouds in the candlelight. I moved through the darkened hallway, checking the windows, but the snow had drifted so high that the glass was reinforced by a wall of white, turning the house into a coffin of wood and ice. Then, I heard the sound of the furnace vents rattling. Not from the air, but from someone tapping on the metal ductwork from inside the basement walls. It was a slow, deliberate metallic clink, moving from the kitchen vent to the living room vent, as if the intruder was tracking my footsteps by the sound of the floorboards groaning above them. I realized with a jolt of pure terror that they weren't just staying in the basement. They were looking for a way to unscrew the floor grates to climb into the vents themselves. I grabbed a heavy iron poker from the fireplace, the cold metal biting into my palm, and I retreated to the upper floor, hoping the height would give me some kind of advantage. As I reached the top of the stairs, I looked down and saw a flicker of movement through the gaps in the floorboards near the vent. A pair of pale, mud-streaked fingers reached through the metal slats of the floor grate, slowly prying the screws loose with a pocket knife. I didn't scream. I knew that showing fear would only embolden whoever was beneath me, so I moved silently into the master bedroom and pushed the heavy dresser in front of the door. I sat on the edge of the bed, clutching the iron poker, listening to the sound of the metal grate finally hitting the hardwood floor with a dull, hollow clang. The intruder was in the house now, and I could hear their wet footsteps moving across the rug, a heavy, dragging sound that suggested they were exhausted or perhaps injured from the storm. I waited for the sound of them coming up the stairs, but instead, I heard the clicking of the kitchen drawers being opened and closed, one by one. They weren't looking for jewelry or electronics. They were looking for a weapon, and the sound of a large chef's knife sliding out of the wooden block sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system that made my hands shake. I knew I couldn't stay in the bedroom because once they reached the door, I would be cornered with nowhere to jump except into a 10-foot snowdrift that would likely bury me alive. I remembered the laundry chute, a small, wooden square in the hallway that dropped straight down into the mudroom, which was technically a separate area from the main kitchen. It was a tight squeeze, but if I could get down there, I could reach the back door and try to dig my way to the neighbor's house. I pushed the dresser back just enough to slip out into the hall, my socks muffling my footsteps on the cold wood. I saw the shadow of a man standing at the bottom of the stairs, his silhouette tall and jagged against the frosted window, holding the long knife downward at his side. He started to climb, his breathing heavy and ragged, each step sounding like a death knell in the frozen quiet of the hallway. I dived into the laundry chute just as his head cleared the top of the banister, the wooden door snapping shut behind me as I slid down the smooth metal lining. I landed hard on a pile of damp towels in the mudroom, my shoulder throbbing with a dull ache, but I didn't have time to check for injuries. I scrambled to the back door, but the snow was packed so tightly against it that the frame wouldn't even budge an inch. I was trapped in a 3-by-3-foot room with the intruder now sprinting back down the stairs toward the mudroom door. I looked around wildly and saw the heavy bottle of bleach on the shelf above the washer. As the door to the mudroom was kicked open, I didn't hesitate. I swung the heavy bottle with all my might, the plastic bursting against the doorframe and drenching the intruder in the caustic, stinging liquid. He cried out, clutching his face as the fumes and the liquid blinded him, and in that moment of chaos, I used the iron poker to shatter the small window above the dryer. I didn't care about the cold or the glass. I scrambled through the opening, falling face first into the deep, soft powder of the blizzard. The shock of the cold was so intense it felt like being hit by a car, but I clawed my way through the drifts, moving toward the glow of the neighbor's emergency floodlights. I reached their porch, pounding on the door until my hands were bruised and bleeding, and when they finally pulled me inside, I looked back at my house. The intruder was standing by the broken window, a dark shape framed by the white storm, but he didn't follow. He knew the police would be coming on snowmobiles within the hour, and he faded back into the shadows of my home. I sat by the neighbor's fire, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, watching the snow continue to fall and knowing that my own house would never feel like a sanctuary ever again. The sound of an ice storm is unlike any other noise in nature, a constant, crystalline ticking that reminds you exactly how thin the barrier is between your warm skin and the frozen world outside. I was standing in the center of the great conservatory, a massive Victorian-style greenhouse filled with rare tropical ferns and towering palms that seemed to shiver every time a fresh gust of wind rattled the thousands of individual glass panes. The power had failed an hour ago, and the backup heaters were struggling to keep the internal temperature above freezing, causing thick plumes of steam to rise from the damp soil and coat the glass in a milky, opaque frost. I was checking the thermostat near the rare orchid display when I heard the first sharp crack, a sound so loud and sudden that I thought the iron frame of the building had finally snapped under the weight of the mounting ice. But when I turned my flashlight toward the sound, I didn't see a structural failure. I saw a single, jagged hole in the glass near the floor and a heavy, ice-covered brick resting among the shattered remains of a prize-winning lily. I stood perfectly still, my heart thudding so hard I could feel it in my throat, listening to the wind whistle through that tiny, jagged opening. It wasn't the storm that had thrown that brick, and as I panned my light across the perimeter, I realized the frosted glass was working against me, turning the person outside into a blurred, shifting shadow that I couldn't quite pin down. I moved toward the main equipment shed in the center of the greenery, my boots crunching softly on the gravel path. But every time I took a step, I heard a corresponding tink on the glass from a different direction. Someone was circling the entire building, tapping on the panes with a metal object, testing for weaknesses or perhaps just trying to drive me into a state of blind panic. I ducked behind a massive terracotta planter, the smell of damp earth and rotting vegetation filling my nose, and I realized that in a house made entirely of glass, there was absolutely nowhere to hide from someone with a thermal scope or a simple flashlight. The tapping stopped abruptly, replaced by the terrifyingly slow screech of a metal crowbar sliding into the frame of the side emergency door. I watched from the shadows of the palm fronds as the door groaned, the ice seal snapping with a sound like a gunshot, and a figure stepped inside, shrouded in a heavy, dark parka that was slick with freezing rain. They didn't move like someone looking for shelter. They moved with a calculated, predatory grace, swinging a long-handled hatchet in a slow arc as they scanned the rows of plants. "I know you're in here," a voice called out, muffled by a heavy scarf but dripping with a chillingly calm confidence that made me realize this wasn't a random encounter. I didn't recognize the voice, but the way they navigated the narrow aisles suggested they had been watching me work for weeks, learning the layout of the greenhouse and the timing of my nightly rounds. I began to crawl through the dense undergrowth of the fern section, the jagged edges of the leaves scratching at my face, moving toward the irrigation control room. If I could reach the manual override for the overhead misting system, I might be able to create enough of a distraction to reach the heavy steel door of the tool cellar. But as I moved, the intruder began to smash the glass panes systematically, one by one, letting the sub-zero air rush into the humid sanctuary. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in seconds, and the tropical plants began to wilt and blacken before my eyes, their large leaves curling inward as the frost claimed them. The intruder was laughing now, a low, guttural sound that was punctuated by the rhythmic shatter crash of the falling glass, creating a chaotic symphony of destruction that masked the sound of my own movement. I reached the control panel, my fingers numb and fumbling with the frozen metal levers, and I managed to yank the emergency valve for the hot water misting line. A massive cloud of white steam erupted from the ceiling, filling the greenhouse with a thick, blinding fog that reduced visibility to less than 2 feet. I heard a startled curse from the intruder as they were swallowed by the whiteout, and I used that moment to sprint toward the back of the building where the heavy ceramic pots were stacked. I didn't go for the exit because I knew they would be watching the doors. Instead, I climbed the iron ladder leading to the internal catwalk that hung 20 feet above the floor. My hands were slick with condensation, and every rung of the ladder felt like a bar of dry ice, but I forced myself upward until I was perched on the narrow metal grating, looking down into the swirling mist. I could see the beam of the intruder's flashlight cutting through the steam below me, darting back and forth like a searchlight as they tried to find their bearings in the artificial cloud. They were standing directly beneath my position, frustrated and swearing, their hatchet buried deep in the trunk of a dying banana tree. I knew I only had one chance to end this before the steam dissipated and left me exposed on the high catwalk. I reached out and grabbed a heavy, 5-gallon glass carboy filled with liquid fertilizer that was sitting on the edge of the supply shelf. With a grunt of exertion, I tipped the massive bottle over the railing, watching it fall through the mist like a heavy transparent stone. It struck the intruder squarely on the shoulder and shattered against the concrete floor, drenching them in the pungent, stinging chemicals and sending them sprawling into a pile of broken glass and mud. They let out a scream of pure agony as the fertilizer seeped into the cuts on their hands and face, and I didn't wait to see if they would get back up. I slid down the ladder, my palms burning from the friction, and ran for the broken side door, leaping over the twisted metal frame and plunging into the waist-deep snow outside. The wind caught me, nearly knocking me flat, but the adrenaline was afire in my veins as I struggled toward the main laboratory building 50 yards away. I reached the heavy reinforced door of the lab and slammed my palm against the security keypad, the red light turning green with a heavenly beep as the electromagnetic lock disengaged. I fell inside, slamming the door shut and sliding the deadbolt just as the figure emerged from the greenhouse, stumbling through the snow like a wounded animal. They stood there for a long time, illuminated by the lab's exterior floodlights, their parka torn and their face a mask of rage and pain, before they finally turned and vanished into the white void of the blizzard. I collapsed against the cold tile floor, listening to the sirens of the county sheriff's snowcats in the distance, knowing that the glass sanctuary I loved had become a graveyard for the plants, but it hadn't become a grave for me.